Vermont Law School for having me here these 2 weeks and treating me so very, very well. I'm having a delightful time exploring the White River and the Connecticut River, and it's so wonderful for me to be from one of the most landlocked states now, Nebraska. Of course, we do have our share of rivers, but none of them run through Lincoln, so it's delightful for me to be back in a river town and experience all of the sensations that you get from being so close to a river. And thank you all for being here this afternoon to hear me talk about unnatural disasters, how law hurts, kind of a retrospective of the last century on the Mississippi River and its tributaries, and how law can potentially help if we can listen to the river, like Mary Oliver says, and move forward in a more appropriate fashion. So my game plan is to talk for about 40 minutes and leave some time for questions. We're getting a bit of a late start, and I know that our class is at 1, so I'll be conscious of that as I go along. So broad themes, how we live with and manage rivers and floodplains, how law has created, or at least exacerbated, unnatural disasters, and how at least 2 aspects of the law can be reformed, so communities can be more resilient to the natural forces of nature. Those 2 that I want to focus on today are among several that we talk about. My co-author, Christy Klein, who teaches at the University of Florida, and I in this book. But the 2 that I want to talk about are federal laws related to river infrastructure, the physical structures that we place on rivers to control floods, and also Fifth Amendment constitutional takings law. One of the reviews of our book came from Professor Dan Farber, who teaches at Berkeley, and he's got a blog that's really worth reading if you're interested in environmental law issues. In his blog, his review of the book says, "We're playing defense against an opponent that's infinitely patient, needing only to find the right time and place to overcome our efforts and knock us flat." I know that some of you that reside along the White River and the Connecticut were, in fact, knocked flat in 2011. So this probably hits pretty close to home for you all. I don't know as much about floods in this part of the country. I'm going to be focusing on inland rivers, but I want to try and think about this opponent, as he characterizes it, the river, and also ways to avoid being knocked flat in the future. So just for orientation, a roadmap, literally a roadmap, although I don't have I-29 and some of the other interstates on this particular roadmap. This is the floodplain. And as you can see, the Mississippi River covers an awful lot of territory. It drains some 30 states, parts of 30 states. Its 3 largest tributaries are the Missouri, the Ohio, and the Arkansas. I grew up right about there on the Missouri River, over in Iowa, northwest Iowa. My co-author, Christy Klein, grew up in St. Louis. So we got together and talked about some of our scholarly interests. We were both really, really interested in rivers in particular, and the way that we live on, play on, respect, revere, and sometimes mismanage rivers. In fact, Christy and I first met on a float trip to the Colorado River, which Professor J.B. Rule, sitting over here, one of our faculty members for the environmental program at Vermont Law this summer. And as I recall, very few people were brave enough to jump in the Colorado River. Imagine a bunch of natural resources law professors floating along on this field trip. You know, we just had this great conference, and well, it was in Las Vegas, which wasn't the best venue necessarily, but nonetheless, it was a great conference. And you know, you can imagine a bunch of sort of stuffed shirts, professors floating along. But Christy and I, stripped down to our swimsuits, jumped into the brown waters of Colorado River. And as I recall, JB, you stuck a toe or 2 in too. So, yeah, I think you did. I think you did. So I knew that these were going to be my peeps, my fast friends for a very, very long time. And that has, in fact, turned out to be true. But Christy and I took it a step further and decided we were going to write about our experiences and what we thought has been happening on the river and what we thought maybe should be happening on the river. So just a little vignette of personal background and why I care so much. People that have picked up the book, looked at the book, people that know me, didn't really know that I had this this deep connection to these particular rivers. And it all goes back to my mom and my mom and dad's honeymoon in 1951. Like I said, I grew up in Sioux City, Iowa, so I spent a lot of time on weekends camping and boating, and fishing, and mushroom hunting, and all those wonderful outdoor pursuits on the Missouri. But my mom and dad, when they got married in 1951, cared about those things, yes, but cared most of all for catching really big fat walleyes out of the headwaters of the Mississippi River up in Minnesota. So my summers, I spent most of my summers, at least 2 or 3 or more weeks every summer, where we could get away from the family farm up in northern Minnesota, pursuing the elusive walleye. Now that looks like a damn big fish, I know, but my mother was kind of a shrimp. She was only about 5'1" on a good day. So you can kind of put things in perspective. But she never did lose her taste for walleye. This is some years later, probably about 1990, at a cabin that they eventually purchased on one of the tributary lakes that are connected to the Mississippi River in northern Minnesota. So I want to tell you just a little bit by reading a passage from the book about my passion for these rivers. When I was little, again, getting personal, my mother bathed me in a garbage can filled with Mississippi River water. Not every night, but just about every summer when my family was camping near the river's headwaters in northern Minnesota. I suppose I smelled a little fishy, but the aroma of river water was completely familiar to me and comforting. I savored the names of the headwater lakes where we camped, titles bestowed by Chippewa and Dakota Indians, or by European explorers who had been through there so many years ago. Itasca, Winnebagochish, Andrusia, Bemidji, Nassau. So I love them. I love these rivers with a passion. The sights, the sounds, the sensations, and yes, even those delectable river smells. So I also thought a lot, and Chrissy and I talked a lot about not just the water and the smells and the sensations, but also the dirt. And I didn't know it then, but my much beloved river bottoms back home on the Missouri, where we have family farms, was actually the floodplain of the river. Who knew? Soils were so fertile as a direct result of frequent flooding. One more short passage. This one happens to be about my father's side of the family, my great-grandfather Gustav, who came from the Castle Garden immigration depot in New York in 1883, straight off the boat from Colmar, Germany. 16-year-old Gustav was anxious to make his mark in the world. He was one of the youngest sons, right? So you couldn't inherit farms, you couldn't do much of anything in Europe in those days. So he gets off in New York and he rides the trains west, marveling as he crosses over the Mississippi River and enters Iowa. He stopped dead when he reached the Missouri River. He'd never seen such black, fertile soil, perfect for the plow. That rich dirt came at a price, however. It was formed and nourished by floods, like the one in 1892, which made Gustav's house list to one side and float away from its foundation. The family escaped. Their baby daughter, my great-aunt Henrietta, was carried to safety by the town doctor, and eventually the house itself and the bulk of our farmland was moved and then situated on higher ground, the bluffs of the Missouri River. So dirt, sediments, floodplains, all of this is part of what makes the middle of the country the breadbasket of the country. Now, things have changed. They've certainly changed in agriculture. In Vermont, I know they have changed in a big way. In my neck of the woods, Nebraska, Iowa, that sort of Midwestern breadbasket area. But 3 of my nephews still farm on the bluffs of the Missouri River on our family farms going back to the early 1890s. One thing that's changed pretty significantly is development on the river. This depicts a place, a development called Dakota Dunes, which happens to be just north of where I grew up, over the line, of the state line in South Dakota. Anybody ever remember those cows, the Gateway Computer cows, right? So the guy who started Gateway Computer was my neighbor. His family owned the cattle company next door to one of our farms. He stimulated economic growth and residential growth in this particular area in an unprecedented way. And part of that came to fruition in Dakota Dunes. This 2,000-acre development is nestled in a scenic elbow between the Missouri and the Big Sioux rivers. It sprung up around 1990, and this happens to be a spot where I used to play and camp and fish and enjoy the river. And as a teenager, yeah, we had bonfires and kegers and like big makeout parties and stuff like that too. You know, we won't really talk about that, but you get the sense of my familiarity with this area and how much it has changed. Now, if you look on the website for Dakota Dunes, it says this is a community of approximately 2,700 residents right between the Missouri and the Big Sioux rivers, with plans to grow to about 5,000 residents over the next 5 to 10 years. More on those plans in just a moment or two. Meanwhile, let's zip on down to my co-author's neck of the woods down in St. Louis. Anybody ever been to the St. Louis Bottoms? You might not have known it, but anybody ever been to Chesterfield Commons? One of the very largest strip malls in the entire country. All right, this too sprung up right around the same time, and it is in the river bottoms of St. Louis, right where Christy used to play and go to farmers markets in her neighborhoods around St. Louis. It was built smack in the middle of the floodplain, paving over thousands of acres of the world's best farmland. How can this happen? How can these kinds of developments take place in such potentially dangerous and certainly vulnerable areas along the river? Well, let's explore that. Back to the basin overview, situating ourselves, orienting ourselves in the geography. This is truly America's river, I should say. It is about 2,350 miles long, give or take, as it snakes its way from the headwaters of Lake Itasca to the Gulf of Mexico. If you were to go as the crow flies, it would only be about half that distance, but nonetheless, it takes a while to get from point A all the way down to point B. Now, we didn't really talk about the Mississippi River unless we mention Mark Twain, aka Samuel Clemens, right? From Life on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi is remarkable in its disposition to make prodigious jumps by cutting through narrow necks of land. More than once, it has shortened itself some 30 miles at a single jump. Now, these cutoffs, he said, have curious effects. They have thrown several river towns into the rural districts, far away from the actual water, and they have built up sandbars and forests in front of them, literally overnight in some cases. Now, Mark Twain loved the river for its unpredictability. Communities and the Federal Corps of Engineers, not so much. The Corps of Engineers initially confined its efforts, going back to the early 1900s, to controlling the river for navigational purposes, both on the upper and the lower river, but it later expanded its efforts to taming the river for flood control. So let's just talk for a couple of minutes about navigation on the upper river in particular. About half of the upper river now, that stretch from Minnesota and Iowa, has been transformed by 29 pairs of locks and dams designed to make smooth passage through some of the rapids for barge traffic to bring all of its grains from the breadbasket to the rest of the country. The Corps proudly refers to its handiwork as a stairway of water, and this is from the Corps of Engineers' own website. And if you look for stairway of water, this is one of the images that will pop up. As a result, the upper Mississippi is more like a series of slack water lakes than anything that resembles a naturally flowing river. In Twain's words again, the engineers have taken upon their shoulders the job of making the Mississippi over again, a job transcended in size only by the original job of creating it. Downstream, the river is just as, sorry about that, let me stick here for a second. The river is just as unnatural. The Corps has remade it in the name primarily of flood control, but also as we get down to the delta of navigation. Certainly the Gulf of Mexico is one of our biggest navigational regions in the country. Talking about the lower river now. The engineers built flood walls reinforced with steel and concrete. They compacted mounds of earth into levees to constrain the Mississippi's normal tendencies to spill beyond its banks. This system of levees and flood walls extends for more than 2,000 miles along the lower Mississippi and its tributaries. measuring separately along each bank of the river. According to some estimates, structures in the upper basin, going back up to Minnesota, Iowa, disconnect the Mississippi River from half of its floodplain. But in the lower basin, the separation is even greater. Here, the river has been walled off from an estimated 90% of its floodplain. We're hoping that these levees that lure people to live and to work on the floodplains, now protected by levees, will protect us and create basically a floodless floodplain. But those who settle here are, of course, gambling that the levees will hold, and they don't always hold. So I want to talk for a few minutes about some of the most significant floods and hurricanes that have happened along the Mississippi and the Missouri and other tributaries. In particular, focusing first on the 1927 flood, which John Barry, in his book Rising Tide, describes in vivid and very detailed prose. 1927, Herbert Hoover was not yet president. The flood, in fact, in part propelled him to the presidency. At the time, he was the Secretary of Commerce. And when the flood of 1927 hit the lower basin of the Mississippi River, he was charged with providing federal disaster relief, with helping with the flood efforts as they unfolded down there in the lower basin. Lots of people, thousands of people were displaced for months at a time. Over 1,000 people died. Pretty high death toll from a flood. The flood caused some $4.5 billion in today's monetary units, in today's dollars. At the time, critics in both Congress and even the Corps described the levees-only policy that had been in place, the federal policy for protecting us from floods, build more levees, as the most colossal blunder in engineering history. This isn't a natural disaster. One of the Corps of Engineers, Admiral, said, colonels, it is a man-made disaster, recognizing that even in 1927. So what happened? Congress responded. Every good disaster typically invokes a congressional response, right? Structures, let's build more structures, not just levees, but also floodways and dikes and revetments and all kinds of other reservoirs, for example, to protect people. So we'll keep our levees, but we'll add a whole mix of structures to the toolbox to better protect the people that have settled in the floodplain. Just a few years later, in part because of the impetus provided by the 1928 Flood Control Act, but also in part by some flooding and some other incidents that were occurring on the Missouri River itself, further upstream, Congress authorized the 1944 Flood Control Act that popped in 6 massive dams, some of which list among the top 10 dams of the world on the upper Missouri River basin. They were built in the late 40s and early 50s throughout the basin. Not just for flood control, I should add, but for navigation, for water supply, for hydropower, for irrigation, for recreation, and for wildlife. Wildlife was even on Congress's radar screen, kind of as something for everyone type of development proposal. One of the issues, one of the perhaps lesser intended consequences of Garrison Dam in North Dakota, in the Missouri River bottomlands, and some of the other dams that were built on the Missouri River in that era, was the displacement of a number of Indian tribes, federally recognized Indian tribes, who lost thousands of acres of their most productive bottomlands. In all these dams on the Missouri flooded about 1 million acres, over a third of which were on tribal lands. We're going to come back to that in just a minute, but this image, which I saw when I was in law school years ago, has always stuck with me, and it's the point at which the Secretary of the Interior, a guy named A.J. Krug, approved the condemnation of 155,000 acres for the Garrison Dam. Those acres were situated on the Fort Berthold Reservation, and Councilman George Dillette stands beside him weeping as the condemnation order is executed. But the dams didn't stop the flooding. Before the last dam went in, but after 5 of the dams were substantially completed, Sioux City, my hometown, experienced significant flooding in both 1951 and 1952. This particular picture depicts a stretch of the Missouri River that runs past Sioux City, Iowa, the downtown area. Up in the corner, the white building in the upper, as you're looking at the upper left-hand corner, is the Sioux City Auditorium, which had just been completed. You can see that it is now up to its gunwales, if you had them, in the floodwaters from the Missouri River. This really hit home for people like my parents, who were putting their faith in technology, putting their faith in these dams to protect them from the floods. Eventually, the floodwaters were cleared away and the town recovered with some additional federal funding and federal responses that weren't just structural. So Congress came along with disaster relief. The president can declare, with the approval of the governor and at the request of the state governor, a package of disaster relief, declare an area as a federal disaster zone, and that leads to federal monies and federal troops that can come and assist with disaster relief in post-flood situation. And somewhat later, federal flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Plan, was adopted as well. So we've got both structural responses from the feds and institutional responses from the feds, coming about in response to floods like the two that I just mentioned, but also hurricanes occurring in the lower stretches of the river. Still, the floods don't stop, right? Rivers still flood. And the question is this kind of infrastructure actually helping save people and their communities and their livelihoods? 1993, fast forward, Chesterfield bottoms again. This is the Boone Bridge down in St. Louis after the Monarch levee failed. The American Society for Civil Engineers says there are only two kinds of levees, those that have failed and those that will fail under the right circumstances. And I think this is perhaps exhibit A of that particular statement. This levee, as you saw earlier, has been rebuilt in much of Chesterfield Bottoms. This big retail commercial strip mall has been built in the very same place that was under 8 feet of water in 1993. Nothing new under the sun, you might say. No talk about Mississippi River flooding would be complete without Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which was predicted very appreciably by some Times-Picayune reporters in 2002, 3 years before the flooding. Reporters in the New Orleans Times-Picayune published this series called Washing Away, aptly named. And they said that vast swaths of New Orleans were vulnerable to hurricane storm surges despite billions of dollars spent on levees and other structures to fortify the city. The message of this series was frightening. Today, set in 2002, billions of dollars worth of levees, seawalls, pumping systems, satellite hurricane tracking, and all these other technological goodies provide a comforting safety margin that saved thousands of lives. But modern technology and engineering mask an alarming fact. Southern Louisiana, Mississippi, growing more vulnerable to hurricanes, not less. More vulnerable, not less. And in fact, 2005, we had levee failures, levees being overtopped, levees being breached, and flooding throughout the city. What exactly happened? Hurricane Category 3, by the time it made landfall, Katrina ranged around a 93,000 square mile area. Hard to sort of get our arms around a territory that's that large, with sustained winds of up to about 125 miles per hour. 80% of New Orleans was awash in floodwater, in some areas up to 20 feet deep. Katrina made history as the deadliest hurricane since 1928, going back to that flood, killing directly or indirectly at least 1,800 people in Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. It was magnified by a confluence of factors, as the series Washing Away had predicted. Primarily, at least for the purposes of this talk, the city system of levees failed, both through overtopping and through breaching, as breaks developed in flood walls, and in some cases just pushed those levees right over. We likely lured people into the path of danger with false assurances of safety. And most of the people were predominantly Black and poor. I don't know of anyone who saw the images in 2005 that can forget very easily what happened at the Superdome in the aftermath. This was supposed to be the place of sanctuary and safety. It didn't really work out quite that way, in part because of poor emergency planning, but in part because of other factors. And I think in part because the people that were most affected were poor and had very little political power, very little voice. Written in chalk, the water is rising. Please, I can guess that the rest of that was probably please help us. Perhaps they ran out of chalk or it was washed away. Let me give you one more example. 2011, I know the print is very, very small, but 2011 is with flooding from Hurricane Irene, which occurred here in this region of the country. Earlier that year, May and June of 2011, the Missouri River experienced some of the greatest flooding that it had seen for many, many decades. Unique peril, still safe. What is this depicting? If you can read it. No U.S. nuclear plant has weathered such flooding. Now this makes me nervous. Don't know about you all, but when Fort Calhoun Nuclear Power Plant, which happens to be situated on a peninsula in the Missouri River, poor planning, maybe? I don't know, not gonna judge. This makes me nervous, this kind of thing, right? Fort Calhoun reactor, so said the reporters in Omaha, is still safe. Not to worry, we've got it under control. It's not a problem. In fact, I've not heard of any particularly adverse consequences. It's not like Fukushima in Japan from the tsunamis, but nonetheless, you know, this is not the kind of thing we really want to see. But we built it, and they came. Not just the nuclear power plants, but also the residences. Let's go back to Dakota Dunes. Remember, they're planning on doubling the size of the population right there, at the crook of the Big Sioux of the Missouri River, just upstream from the Fort Calhoun power plant, despite the flooding in 2011. By August of 2011, that community was still under several feet of water. Now again, most of the people that are adversely affected by most of these floods and hurricanes that I have mentioned are disproportionately impoverished in minority populations, be they African American or tribal members. Most of them do not have sunrooms and turrets on the side of their houses. I must say, this is perhaps a little unique. But remember, it is a, pardon the pun, gateway community that we're talking about in Dakota Dunes. A little bit different than some of the others. I just want to talk for 1 second about environmental injustice throughout the century. We mentioned this aspect of the Katrina flooding. We mentioned this aspect of the construction of the reservoirs in the upper Missouri River and the displacement of the Indian tribes, going all the way back to some of the earliest floods in the early 1900s. The refugees primarily were Black sharecroppers. And in one case that we uncovered by tediously going through microfilms from newspapers back at this time, at one point, Black sharecroppers were used as sandbags to stack them up and prevent flooding along the lower Mississippi River in the state of Mississippi. When we run out of sandbags, just have them lay down. At gunpoint, of course, and see if we can stop the waters from flowing. Fast forward, just after Hurricane Katrina, this picture always kind of strikes a chord with me. President Bush posing by Ethel Williams, who is a resident of the Upper Ninth Ward, one of the areas of New Orleans that was most adversely affected. He came down, and Ethel describes herself as an eternal optimist. And she is getting her house rebuilt, some road home monies from federal disaster relief funneled through the state of Louisiana. And she's excited. Her house has been torn out, it's ready to be rebuilt. President Bush comes down, poses next to her. This picture comes from an NPR story in 2006. The house was being rebuilt. It ultimately was rebuilt and ready for occupation again, not until January of 2009, some years later. By then, unfortunately, Ethel had died of breast cancer, so she never got to live in her new home. And there's stories like this, showing us some of the environmental injustices that are experienced by some of our floodplain policies and management responses. So the question then should be, what's next? 21st century flood control policy, what's that going to look at? Can we do better? Can we move beyond just structures, concrete, and after the fact disaster relief? And prospective flood insurance that in many instances has not really worked out all that well. Not that many people have actually bought into the federal flood insurance program, and those that have oftentimes drop their insurance after a year or two in the bank when they have their mortgages no longer really monitoring or paying attention, and the feds haven't really been monitoring or paying attention. There's some other issues about the National Flood Insurance Program that I could talk about, but Christy actually, my co-author, came here and talked about it at Vermont in April of 2011, I think it was, or perhaps 2012, it was 2012. And so she's kind of covered that aspect of the book. I'd be happy to take questions about it if we want to talk about it. But let me focus on structures and some of the other reforms that I think we should be thinking about instead of continuing our quest for a floodless floodplain. Rivers will flood. Levees are going to fail. Unwise flood development will happen. We let it. But what are some of the alternatives? How about floodplain restoration? I know Professor Rule writes a lot about ecosystem services and restoration of ecosystems, wetlands, and other areas that have been adversely affected, and some of the benefits by way of filtration, protection from flooding, and wildlife habitat and fisheries that can come from restoration efforts coupled with adaptive responsive management. And I know we'll be talking about that next week, I think, right? So, he's teaching a class on it too. So, if you have questions about that, he's the guy. I'll just point you right on over there to J.B. Rule. But nonetheless, this is one of the efforts that's reconnecting floodplain forests to rivers in Louisiana. Now, we probably can't do that everywhere. There's some physical and certainly some economic constraints, but it's something to think about. Restoration, instead of slapping in ever more concrete, ever more levees, ever more revetments and reservoirs and floodways, in structures that help, or that we hope will help protect people from flooding. Maybe in some instances we can let the river flood. And perhaps in the long run that would work better if it's a tool, floodplain restoration tool that's used wisely. Like I said, probably can't take place, might be unrealistic to think of it in every situation, but certainly it should be one of the tools in our toolbox. What's stopping us from doing that? What's stopping us from maybe moving some people away from the river instead of trying to straitjacket the river from people? We let unwise floodplain development happen in part because of political pressure. People want to live on the White River, right? I do. I would move here in a heartbeat. It's gorgeous. I want to live on the Missouri River. My family long ago decided to move up to the bluffs, but I get it. And the political pressure from the folks in Dakota Dunes and other places is pretty intense, and it's really hard for a local floodplain manager or county planner to really take a stand against improper development of the floodplain. But part of it, too, is not just political, not just economic at the moment, but also a fear of federal constitutional and state constitutional takings claims, for that matter. And let me just give you a flavor of this. This is a complaint that was filed by some 200 Missouri River floodplain occupants, farms, communities, and others, led by an entity known as Idaho Farms, Inc., a corporate farming operation, against the United States, just filed in 2014, in March of 2014, claiming that there's been a taking of their floodplain land without just compensation by virtue of the floods of 2011, by means of a significant and deliberate departure by the Corps of Engineers from its decade-old policy and practice regarding the management of the reservoir system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that particular complaint. The attorneys are hoping to rake in over $250 million in claims for their clients. Again, there are over 200 of them, so they'll share that, presumably if they are in fact awarded some relief. They also hope to recoup at least $1 million in expenses and fees for themselves. Ambulance-chasing attorneys, right? I don't know. In fact, I'm quite sure that some of you in this room are not attorneys, so I had to throw that in there. They're likely to be disappointed, quite frankly. And I wrote a blog about this. If anybody's interested, I can point to it. But courts find that floodplain management constitutes a regulatory taking in only the rarest of cases. Whether the impact to private property occurs through land use restrictions on construction, or through flood control structures like dams and levees that failed, or they were not operated in quite the way that your plaintiffs might have wished. This is because the impact on the floodplain owners who are ultimately flooded is neither a permanent physical occupation of the property, nor is it depriving them of all economically beneficial use, or otherwise does it go too far, adversely affecting reasonable investment-backed expectations of the floodplain owners. Is it really reasonable to settle in a floodplain, to farm in a floodplain, and expect that the property will never flood? Maybe not. These particular plaintiffs, though, are attempting to bring their claims within the purview of a 2012 Supreme Court case called Arkansas Fish and Game Commission versus the United States. This is the U.S. Supreme Court, where the landowner, who happened to be a state Fish and Game Commission, prevailed on its claim that the Corps of Engineers had physically occupied and taken a flowage easement over its land. That particular case, though, raised a very unique set of facts. It is completely inapposite to what happened on the Missouri River in 2011. Here's why. In stark contrast to the 2011 Missouri River flood, the Corps intentionally flooded Arkansas Fish and Game Commission's land in a direct and foreseeable way. In fact, they deviated from their river control plan, their master plan for the Arkansas River, intentionally at the behest of farmers who said that they really needed a longer growing season, keep the water off our croplands. And so the Corps created winners and losers by saying that farmers, you win. We're going to help you out in our management of this river. Fish and Game Commission with your wildlife refuge. Sorry, but yeah, your trees are going to get saturated. Yeah, that's probably going to cause some damage, but we have the power, congressionally, under our flood control acts, to weigh the costs and the benefits. And this is how we do that, and the discretion. The Supreme Court in the end forced it to pay all over the commission, and I think most of us maybe would say, well, perhaps that's fair. That was intentional. It was foreseeable. This is a remedy for the Corps of Engineers' intentional foreseeable response. On the Missouri, the floodwaters came not from an intentional manipulation to benefit one party at the loss of another, but from unprecedented amounts of snowmelt and rain over an incredibly long period in the spring and summer of 2011. The Rocky Mountain snowpack, which is where we get a lot of our water in the headwaters, particularly over on the Missouri, was 140% of normal. We keep talking about drought over in the Rockies and in the West, but this particular year, 2011, was 140% normal. And rainfall later that spring and early summer was 3 to 6 times normal in the upper Missouri River Basin. That water had to go somewhere, and once the dams were filled to capacity, it went downstream and into the floodplain, as rivers, I might say, naturally do. Now don't get me wrong, nobody wants to see human suffering in the wake of a flood, but adding a constitutional takings claim to the list of government payouts demanded by property owners, we can talk about this if you wish, but think about farm subsidies, think about federally subsidized insurance for residents and for strip malls in the floodplain, and all sorts of other kinds of government infrastructure that's given to landowners pretty much anywhere, but certainly floodplain owners. Really, should courts recognize these kinds of claims when the floodplain owners are ultimately flooded by an unprecedented event, such as what happened in 2011? We call it a double take. You take on the front end the government infrastructure, the government aid, the government subsidies. You take on the back end by raising the constitutional takings claims when things go wrong. Instead, I think we should be talking about how to make people safer, how to make buildings more flood resilient, and about cases where it's just plain prudent to retreat from the floodplain out of harm's way. I wanted to end, and then have some time for questions, with the end of that Mary Oliver poem that Melissa started us out with at the beginning of this talk. While we sit here in a house filled with books, ideas, doubts, hesitations, the river keeps coming, touching us, passing by on its long journey, its pale, infallible voice, singing. This is my dad. Rested on the back of a little dory that we used to keep on one of our look all that comfortable. Apparently he found it very relaxing. He just let the river roll on by. He was pretty good at that for an old German farmer. Kind of surprising that he could do that and appreciate poetry like Mary Oliver. So thank you very much for your patience and for your attention, and I would love to hear questions in the time that we have. Those of you that have to bolt for your classes, please don't hesitate. No offense. Oh, yes, right.
I guess to me the hardest question is the political question, because as you said, you started off by saying, you know, it's great to be, you know, along the White River, and you think about historical geography, and all the big cities are either on rivers or on the coast, and people want to be next to those water courses, and you know, as you put it, you know, unwise development will happen if we let it. Putting aside the legal question, how do you? I mean, what I always been wondering about New Orleans is how would you change the political dynamic? Unfortunately, the only thing that changed it was significant depopulation of those floodplain areas, and I've never been able to come up with a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can either. And I know Tom Henry, who was also joining Vermont Law School this summer as a distinguished media scholar, plies his trade for the Toledo Glade. Toledo, Ohio, another great floodplain town, which grew up there precisely because the industries needed fresh water resources to carry on their businesses. And I think for New Orleans, if we go back to New Orleans, it really is an impossible city, given where it's located below sea level, but also perhaps an inevitable city, perhaps like those on the Great Lakes and the Great Eastern Rivers and some of our Great Western Rivers. Impossible and yet inevitable cities because we needed navigation, we needed development of commerce, and at the time, water was the main transportation. We need fresh water to run our power plants these days. So we have cities that are inevitable, but in some instances, as we step back and take a closer look at them, they're kind of impossible too. And it's impossible to maintain them in their current state, I think, is perhaps what one of the messages we want to send from our book is, you know, in some places, you can't just protect the people in those cities with levees and pumps to pump out the water when it comes through the flood. You have to maybe create some open spaces, going back to the Wichita down in Louisiana. Minnesota has done a really good job of this in the aftermath of the 1993 floods. Now, those aren't any really big cities. For the most part, Minnesota said, we're going to take some of this farmland and do voluntary buyouts and get the farmers to maybe give us a flowage easement or a temporary conservation easement, or sometimes are not temporary, permanent conservation easement, where they can continue farming in the floodplain, knowing that there's going to be some years where they are wiped out. And so there are perhaps some more institutional responses that can help with that political and economic problem and change the face of some of our floodplain cities. But I think, like you said, in New Orleans, we've got the opportunity primarily because the city has been so widely depopulated. So we have a chance to go forward a little bit more sensibly, I think. And that's not true.
Yeah, just a couple of points. You're right about Toledo, the Great Lac Swamp, as it was known, and people have mentioned they've been to other parts of the country, and they, especially with the water wars that are becoming more acute, everyone is amazed that there's an area like Toledo where the objective is to drain water out instead of trying to keep water or find water. We're trying to get rid of water and move it out. But I was going to mention, since you mentioned the Times-Picayune series, one of the writers, Mark Schlesstein, is a personal friend of mine through the Society of Environmental Journalists, and he's a two-time Pulitzer winner, and he has a great story, and I've even written about this in because of all the challenges we face in the media with corporate, buyouts and things like that. You had mentioned the Omaha paper saying everything's hunky-dory with the flood situation there. But Mark had done this series, and they had some real high-level discussions of should we publish it or not? Is it ethical to tell people, lay out a forecast of what could happen? To him, it was an accountability issue with the Corps of Engineers not doing its job and delivering the kind of levy that they expected it would. And he said that one of the senior editors in a meeting even called it, quote unquote, more of Schlestein's disaster porn, that he's just trying to scare people. We got overruled, they published it, and now his son and others call him Nostradamus for predicting the future in eerie detail, and he ended up on national TV and things like that, almost like a local folk hero. But I guess what I was leading to with all that was, since everybody, years later, and presumably for many more years, a decade later, is still talking about Katrina, how do you see that as a legal landmark or precedent to try to, there are going to be many other places along the Mississippi River and even in the Great Lakes region where I would imagine people are looking at the experience of Katrina and kind of getting, maybe has it made, or do you feel it's making public officials and lawyers realize that, much like 9/11 or Fukushima, that yes, the unthinkable can happen. Does that make sense? And can even happen in smaller cities like Sioux City and wherever up and down, where you may need to do a structure. If you're doing a structure, if you need a structure, you need to do one that may be more robust, especially in an era of climate change, that things that you may need to engineer things with more to be more robust. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You hear a good bit about much broader Louisiana restoration plan, which had been drafted, had been talked about by scientists primarily, and some of the NGOs, environmental NGOs, prior to Hurricane Katrina, and you hear some encouragement that that's taking on legs. But then you've got people like Senator Mary Landrieu sitting in Congress that is, at least from the outside looking in, appears to be far more interested in developing even more oil and gas infrastructure. One piece of the Hurricane Katrina puzzle that I can talk about is the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. And along with that was navigation, but also a ton of infrastructure for oil and gas pipelines, which together operated as a hurricane superhighway, bringing the waters into the city like a bullseye. So we've got these countervailing tensions. One, yes, restoration and softer responses, institutional responses rather than cement, are what we talk about. And I think planners in Sioux City after 2011, two of my nephews, you're no longer a full-time farmer, right? Even with 3 different family farms under your belt, they are both city engineers for the city of Sioux City. So it's like, yeah, we're talking about planning and and zoning and doing all these things, but what do we really do? One of them is a cement tester, and he's like, I am out every day testing the new bridges, the new abutments, the new this, the new that. So they're pouring cement while they're talking about planning. And I think that's happening all over the country. So I wish I were like Ethel Williams, more of an eternal optimist, but we get whipsawed back and forth. There was a big reform to the National Flood Insurance Program after Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, spelled differently than my own name, just to throw that out there, S-A-N-D-Y. Congress got a little fortitude and said, we're gonna make the premiums for the federal flood insurance program actually, but slowly, escalate to something that better reflects market rates. Less subsidies, people pay more for living in the floodplain, in certain circumstances at least. Once the insurance premiums actually started to go up as they were being phased in, Congress blinked and actually just a few months ago stepped away and said, oh, no, we completely rescind that reform that we just adopted, because people were screaming about it. They saw their premiums going from, in one instance, I think it was like $30 a month to about $300, tenfold at least a month. So, yeah, it's a perpetual problem, and I don't know the answer. I think one of the best things we can do is talk about it and get people from different disciplines and different levels of government in the room to have an honest conversation. Yeah, you had been it for a while, I'm sorry.
Well, a lot of what you're saying, I mean, Vermont going on at post-Irene, I mean, I live in Chelsea. The entire bridge to bridge village of Chelsea is in a floodplain, and in a floodway, no less. And when all of the regulations came down post-Sandy, it wasn't 300-fold. It was people's flood insurance went from, $7,000 a year to $1,000 a month. Okay, and it becomes unaffordable. And then the town came through and assessed everyone that was in the floodway. Their homes basically went down at a minimum of $50,000 a piece. So what I have found as an attorney watching what's going on is that it really there hasn't been any zoning stopping of building in there. What happens is people figure out that they can actually end run around it. We're having permits issued for like 1 inch above the low-rise level of the floodplain. And so they're sort of coming up with surveyors who will say that it ends at the corner of their barn and not, dead smack in the middle of it. And because our maps are so old, there really isn't any countervailing, if anything, the surveyor's more likely to be right than the 1978 maps.
Right.
And so, but what you have is they do nail some people, and in particular, they come down hard on some, and other people maybe who don't have the money to get the surveyor, or maybe who come up with these novel interpretations. So I haven't seen any decrease in building in the floodway. What I have found is really nasty kind of politics about that. That if you go through certain hoops and you do certain things, you can build. And if you actually try to play by the rules and go and get the opinion from the state first, you're virtually dead in the water. Yeah. And so I'm not so sure that the whole command and control thing is going to work. And I do think I sympathize with the landowners who all of a sudden their nest egg becomes virtually worthless because whoever can't afford that insurance won't get the mortgage, and therefore there's 12 houses for sale in the village. You know what I mean? So there has to be a balance between those who exist there and frankly want to stay there, because otherwise I think a lot of people are bolting.
Right.
But I think we'll have a ghost town at least in half of the village.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. Just from driving around the countryside these past 10 days, or however long I've been here, I've thought about that quite a lot. And although I don't know all the facts and figures and the response to Irene and what happened here in any great detail, I can see what a quandary it's got to be. And I can also see that many of these communities are not particularly wealthy, and the burden often falls on those communities. Afford the lawyers, or afford the surveyors, or whatever the case may be. And that's true in many parts of the country.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there.